He walked into the courtroom in a dark blue presidential suit, calm, silent, and said just one word: accountability. The judge froze. The corrupt cop took a step back. Then he opened a folder, and everything changed. But what happened next will shock even those who've seen it all. Let's start from the beginning. Tamika Wallace stood at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles white from pressure. The courtroom was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that carried judgment. Every gaze that fell on her felt like a weight pressing into her chest, not just watching, but measuring, assuming, condemning. She wore a simple, clean blouse and a navy skirt that had faded at the seams. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, as if the control she lacked over the situation might be found in how she presented herself. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't a danger to anyone. She was a mother, a nurse, a woman who had sacrificed everything to protect her children. But today, the state of Georgia had decided she wasn't fit to be either. At the prosecution table sat her ex-husband, Detective Mark Halberd, clean-cut, confident, draped in the authority of his badge. He leaned back in his chair like he owned the room, because in a way he did. Everyone here knew him. He played poker with the judge on Fridays. The bailiff, McNally, had gone hunting with him last spring. Even the prosecutor had once worked as his junior officer before switching to law. This wasn't a courtroom. This was a battlefield. And Tamika had shown up without armor. The charges against her were not criminal, but they were cruel. Neglect, they called it. Failure to provide a safe environment for her children. On paper, it sounded like a formality, a custody hearing. But for Tamika, it was a war over her very identity. If she lost today, her children would be placed in temporary foster care. She had already been separated from them for 3 weeks. Her youngest, Jayla, was only 6. Her son Marcus had just turned 9. Birthdays were supposed to be full of cake, laughter, balloons. He'd spent his in a stranger's living room with a social worker who barely knew his name. And why? Because Mark Halberd wanted revenge. Their marriage had ended 3 years ago, quietly at first. But when Tamika discovered he'd been using his position to intimidate people, fabricating reports, threatening teenagers into confessions, she filed a complaint. Internal Affairs buried it. Mark was too useful, too clean-cut. Tamika's life, however, took a different turn. The whispers began. At work, her schedule was suddenly reduced. At church, people stopped meeting her eyes. It wasn't spoken out loud, but it didn't have to be. In a town like Magnolia Grove, Georgia, everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew who had the power. Mark had accused her of being unstable, claimed she had shouted at him during drop-offs, that the kids had come home with bruises, all unsubstantiated, all circumstantial. But the court didn't need proof. It needed reputation. And Mark's shined while Tamika's was carefully, methodically tarnished. Her lawyer, Jonathan Reed, a well-meaning but overworked public defender, had tried to fight. He had requested a change of venue, citing conflict of interest. Denied. He had asked for a continuance to gather more evidence. Denied. Every motion, every objection was met with cold efficiency. "Mr. Reed, this court will not tolerate delays," the judge had said sternly that morning. "We have a full docket, and this case is not exceptional." Not exceptional. Tamika tried not to react, but her heart sank at those words. How could they say that? Didn't they see her? Didn't they hear what this meant? This wasn't paperwork. It was her family, her life, her babies. From her place at the defense table, she could barely see her children. They were sitting in the back row beside a social worker who avoided eye contact. Jayla's feet didn't touch the floor. She kept swinging them nervously, her little fingers gripping the hem of her dress. Marcus sat stiffly, eyes locked on his mother, trying to be brave, trying not to cry. like a little man. Tamika gave him the smallest nod. "It's okay," her eyes said. "I'm still fighting." But inside, she was drowning. The courtroom lighting was harsh, fluorescent and sterile. Every cough echoed too loudly. The air conditioner rattled overhead, the only real sound aside from the scribble of pens and the quiet clicking of laptop keys. The prosecutor's voice droned as she went over the allegations again, misrepresenting them, twisting moments out of context to paint Tamika as negligent, careless, even dangerous. She failed to ensure consistent transportation to school. She left them home alone while she worked long shifts. There were several days when meals were not properly documented. Documented? Tamika wanted to scream. She was working double shifts at the hospital during COVID surges. She had to leave early some mornings to avoid losing her job. She cooked every night, even if it meant reheating pasta at midnight. What kind of system punishes a mother for trying to survive? This one. Mark watched her the whole time, smirking, arms folded. His demeanor was perfectly rehearsed, respectful, concerned, worried for the children. He even had the gall to tell the court he wished Tamika well and only wanted what was best for the kids. The words dripped with venom masked as virtue. No one questioned the bruises Marcus had gotten on his leg, not when Tamika claimed it happened during a weekend visit with Mark. No investigation, no medical exam, just silence. Jonathan leaned toward her and whispered, "We're not winning here, Tamika. I need you to prepare yourself for the worst." She turned her head slowly. "I've already lived through it." The court took a recess. As the judge exited, chatter erupted, the kind that fills a vacuum when tension is too thick to sit quietly with. Reporters in the hallway murmured. Someone chuckled near the back. Someone else said, "Figures." Tamika sat down, staring at her hands. She had scrubbed those hands raw for years at the hospital, held dying patients, delivered babies, changed bedpans and IV bags. She had done everything right. And still, somehow, it was never enough. Not for this town. Not for this courtroom. Not when the system was designed to believe the uniform before the woman. Not when the unseen war had already chosen its winner. The 10-minute recess felt more like 10 hours. Tamika remained seated, motionless, in the same worn courtroom chair as everyone bustled around her. People chatted, laughed. The security guard at the door checked his phone. One of the reporters sipped from a styrofoam cup and whispered something to a colleague while glancing in her direction. And then, she felt it. That chill. Mark was standing again, slowly approaching. His boots echoed louder than they should have on the polished wooden floor. There was no purpose to his movement. This wasn't court procedure, nor a legal step. It was something else. A calculated, subtle move meant for intimidation. Her lawyer was gone, out in the hallway making a call. Tamika locked eyes with him. "Still playing the victim, huh?" he whispered, the corner of his mouth barely moving. She didn't respond. He leaned a little closer. "You should have stayed in your place." And then, he smirked. In one sudden, deliberate movement, he spat in her face. A thick, vile glob landed just below her left eye. Warm, disgusting, public. Gasps rippled across the courtroom like an invisible explosion. A woman in the gallery audibly choked. One man dropped his notebook. The bailiff, McNally, stood up, but didn't move forward. Tamika froze. Not from fear, from shock, from the raw, searing shame of being so violently dehumanized in front of a full courtroom and her children. She didn't flinch, didn't wipe it off. She just sat there, breath caught in her throat, heart pounding like a drum inside a cage. "Mark," with all the confidence of someone who'd done this before and never paid for it, turned his back and walked away. McNally finally moved, but not toward Mark. Instead, he stepped between Tamika and the gallery, like she was the threat. She saw it happen in slow motion, as if she were detached from her body. He extended his arm, holding it up toward her. "Ma'am," he said gruffly, "let's not escalate anything." Escalate? She hadn't moved an inch. Jonathan returned a few seconds later and stopped in his tracks. "What the hell happened?" he demanded, looking from Tamika's face to the retreating figure of Mark Halberd. "He spit on her," someone in the back said aloud. "We all saw it." But no one did anything. The judge returned moments later and took her seat, unaware, or pretending to be unaware, of what had just happened. The court reporter adjusted her headset. The prosecutor smirked. Halberd sat back down, calm as ever. Tamika wiped her cheek only after she saw Marcus's horrified eyes lock with hers from across the room. He was standing now, halfway out of his seat, his fists clenched. The social worker tugged him back down harshly. Jayla was crying quietly into her sleeve. Tamika wanted to run to them, to hold them, to tell them she was okay, but she wasn't. Inside her chest, something cracked. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. It was the slow splintering of years of survival, of quiet endurance, of hoping the system would eventually see her for who she really was. Instead, it kept seeing the badge, and it kept seeing her as something less than. The judge looked annoyed. "Let's proceed," she said, her voice sharp. "The children's welfare cannot wait on dramatics." Dramatics. Tamika didn't speak. Her lawyer began to object, but she gently touched his wrist and shook her head. "Not yet. Let them speak. Let them lie." The system had already made up its mind. The prosecutor stood again and began painting a portrait of chaos and irresponsibility. The tragic failure of a mother overwhelmed by her circumstances. He used phrases like emotional instability and questionable judgment, implying drug use without saying it, questioning her mental health without providing a single medical record. And Mark? He played his part to perfection. He kept glancing toward the jury box with his practiced cop face, furrowed brow, tight lips, occasional shake of the head, as if deeply saddened by Tamika's condition. "She's not a bad person," he said during his testimony. "But I worry. That's all I've ever done. Worry about my children." Tamika's jaw locked. He was a monster with a script, and everyone was eating it up. The judge nodded approvingly as he finished, like a teacher hearing a well-rehearsed answer. The courtroom buzzed again during the next break, this time with a different energy. Tamika could hear fragments. "She's unstable. I heard she used to yell at him in the parking lot. He's such a good dad. Shame." No one remembered the bruises, the ignored reports, the sleepless nights. No one cared that she was a nurse who had risked her life during the pandemic to save others. All they saw now was a woman being outplayed in a system stacked against her. By the end of the day, the judge announced her intention to rule the following morning. The recommendation? Temporary removal of the children. Immediate custody to Halberd. Tamika couldn't move. Jonathan leaned toward her. "I can appeal it, but it'll take time." "How long?" "Too long." That night, she sat alone in her small apartment, the silence louder than any siren. She didn't eat, didn't sleep, just stared at the wall as the minutes crawled by. On the floor by the door were her children's drawings, forgotten in the chaos. One was a stick figure of her and the kids in a park. Above it, Marcus had written in big, blocky letters, "My mom is a hero." She pressed the paper to her chest and cried. Not because she was giving up, but because in this world, in this town, being right wasn't enough. You had to be seen, and no one was seeing her. Yet, The next morning, the courtroom was colder, not in temperature, in atmosphere. A hollow chill filled the space, like everyone knew something awful had happened the day before. But no one was going to speak of it. Tamika Wallace sat at the defendant's table again, her posture straighter than ever, her expression unreadable. Her soul, however, was in fragments. She hadn't slept. Her face still burned with the memory of Mark Halberd's spit sliding down her cheek. No one had reprimanded him. No formal complaint had been filed, no outrage from the court, no condemnation. It was as if it never happened, except it had. Everyone saw it. Everyone chose to forget it. And that was worse than the act itself. The courtroom filled slowly that morning. Spectators took their seats. The social worker walked in, this time with a new assistant in tow, a young white woman with a clipboard who didn't so much as glance at Tamika. She was already referring to Marcus and Jayla as transitional minors. They weren't children anymore. They were cases. The judge walked in, more rushed than the day before. She seemed agitated, flipping through papers with clipped movements. "Let's move quickly," she barked. "I have 3 custody reviews and a preliminary hearing before lunch." Tamika blinked. Quickly? They were deciding the fate of her family, her children's lives, and it was being treated like a coffee order in a drive-thru. Then came the moment Tamika dreaded. The recommendation report. It was read aloud by the social worker with mechanical detachment. Based on observed behaviors, instability in schedule, and lack of adequate support system, we recommend that primary custody be granted to the biological father, Detective Mark Halberd, effective immediately. Tamika couldn't breathe. And that minor children Marcus Wallace, age 9, and Jayla Wallace, age 6, be relocated within 24 hours to the approved guardian's residence? No. With biweekly supervised visits to be determined at the discretion of the court and caseworker. No. 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 Tamika gripped the edge of the table until her fingers ached. Her jaw trembled, but she would not cry. Not now. Not in front of him. Mark sat across from her, arms crossed, gaze heavy with triumph. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His silence said it all. You never had a chance. The judge looked up. "Ms. Wallace, do you have any final statement before I issue the official ruling?" Tamika opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her throat locked, heart pounding in her ears. She looked to her children, seated in the back row. Marcus sat straight, trying to be brave, but his eyes were wide and terrified. Jayla clutched her backpack like a life jacket, her legs swinging, her chin trembling. The judge waited, and just as Tamika found the strength to speak, Mark Halberd stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to approach the bench." She nodded. He moved toward the bench with slow confidence, but he didn't go directly there. He made a sharp detour, straight to Tamika, again. Every cell in Tamika's body screamed danger. Jonathan stood, confused, but before he could move, smack, no fist, no slap. He leaned in, slowly, so only she could hear him, and said, "You lose, just like always." Then he stepped back and spat on the floor next to her foot, right in front of her chair. Deliberate, measured, controlled. Not enough to be criminal, but enough to degrade. Gasps again. Murmurs. A couple people stood up, unsure of what they were witnessing. "Order in the court," the judge said flatly, not even looking up from her notes. Tamika slowly looked down at the spit beside her shoe. It shone under the courtroom lights. A tiny, grotesque puddle of everything she'd been forced to swallow for years. And something in her snapped. She stood. Jonathan tried to stop her, but she brushed past him. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She walked calmly to the front of the courtroom, past her own desk, past the prosecutor, past the bailiff who hesitated to intervene. She stopped in front of the judge. "Your Honor," she said softly, "I want this on the record." The judge raised an eyebrow. "My children watched a police officer assault their mother, twice, in your courtroom, in front of witnesses, in front of God, and you said nothing." The judge opened her mouth, but Tamika didn't let her speak. "You don't need to take my word for it. Look at the cameras." She turned to the crowd. "You all saw it, and you did nothing. You looked away. Like I was invisible. Like I deserved it." No one responded. The judge banged her gavel once. "Ms. Wallace, that's enough." "No, Your Honor, it's not. Not anymore." Tamika's voice broke, not from weakness, but from rage buried too long. "You think I'm unfit? That I'm unstable? Maybe I am. Because this system has tried everything it could to break me, but I'm still standing. You took my sleep. You took my money. You took my dignity. And now you're taking my children." She paused. "But you won't take my voice." Silence. The gavel slammed harder. "Enough!" And then the courtroom doors creaked open. The sound echoed almost like thunder. Everyone turned, and that's when he walked in. A tall black man in a sharp presidential blue suit, crisp white shirt, burgundy tie, immaculate shoes. He carried nothing but a leather folder tucked under one arm. He walked with intent, with authority, as if this courtroom didn't scare him, as if nothing could. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep and steady. "May I approach?" The judge blinked. "And who are you?" The man stopped mid-aisle. The entire room held its breath. He looked at Tamika, then back at the judge, and said just one word. "Accountability." The word echoed like thunder. "Accountability." The judge froze. The prosecutor dropped her pen. Even Mark, so smug and controlled, blinked in surprise. All eyes turned to the tall man in the presidential blue suit, now standing confidently in the center of the courtroom. His voice wasn't raised. He didn't shout, but it carried weight, like a gavel dropped by something higher than this courtroom, higher than this judge, higher than the rigged game Tamika Wallace had been dragged into. But then the moment passed. The judge cleared her throat, pulled her authority back around herself like a judicial robe, and snapped, "Unless you are counsel for either side or a registered witness, I'll have to ask you to step outside." The man's eyes didn't waver. "No, Your Honor, I won't. I'm here on official federal authority. My name is Inspector Anthony Keller, Office of Civil Court Oversight, DOJ." He reached into his jacket and, with one fluid motion, produced a badge, not one of the local shiny trinkets thrown around Magnolia Grove, but a sleek black ID wallet marked with a federal seal. The judge blanched. The prosecutor paled. Even McNally, the lazy bailiff, stiffened. Keller's tone never changed. "I suggest no one make any further procedural decisions until you review this." He stepped forward, calm and silent, and placed a thick manila envelope on the bench. Then, turning slightly, he locked eyes with Tamika, just for a moment, and nodded. It was the first time in days someone looked at her without pity, without suspicion, without the quiet, heavy question, what did she do to deserve this? Keller looked at her like she mattered, and for the first time in days, Tamika felt like she still existed. But then, the moment vanished, just as quickly. The judge dismissed the court for recess to review new material. The jury was excused. Spectators ushered out. No questions were answered. No explanations given. Tamika was left standing in the middle of the courtroom, alone once more. Her lawyer approached her with wide eyes. "Tamika, what just happened?" She didn't respond. Her legs were trembling, her hands numb. She felt like she was floating just above herself, untethered from reality. Everything felt surreal. The federal inspector, the sudden shift in the room, the envelope, the possibility. But hope was dangerous. It made you believe something good might happen, only for the system to crush it again. She had learned that the hard way. Hope could hurt worse than despair. Her children were escorted out of the courtroom by the social worker during recess. Marcus looked back over his shoulder, trying to catch one last glimpse of his mother. Jayla had her face buried in the woman's coat. Tamika watched them go, unable to speak. She didn't cry. Not yet. Her body was too tired. Her emotions had gone underground. She found herself back on the bench in the waiting room, across from vending machines that hummed like bored machines in a forgotten diner. She didn't move, didn't eat, didn't drink. People passed her without stopping, as if she were furniture, as if she were already gone. Jonathan Reed sat beside her, slowly, cautiously. "I don't know who that man is," he said, almost to himself. "But I saw the seal. That's real. That's very real." Tamika said nothing. "You okay?" he added. Still nothing. Her mind was somewhere else, in the space between everything and nothing, in the weightless void where you're too broken to feel anger, too drained to feel fear, too wounded to scream. They wanted to take her children. They'd already taken her dignity. Now they were trying to take herself. When she finally returned to her apartment that night, the world outside felt too quiet. Her keys fumbled in the lock. Her body moved mechanically, like muscle memory was all she had left. The living room was untouched, as if the chaos of the courtroom couldn't reach this far. But it had. The silence in that room was deafening. Everywhere she looked, she saw her children. Jayla's coloring book still lay open on the floor, a red crayon snapped in half. Marcus's backpack slumped near the couch, one strap twisted, like he'd tossed it aside in a rush. A paper he'd written in school was still pinned to the fridge. "My hero is my mom." She stood in front of it, staring at the crooked handwriting. Something cracked. She fell to her knees. The sobs came out of nowhere, deep, guttural, raw. She cried for her children. She cried for the years she had tried to do everything right and still ended up here. She cried because the world didn't care that she had worked double shifts to buy her son's asthma medication, or that she had walked to work in the rain when her car broke down because she couldn't afford repairs. She cried because no one ever looked at Mark and asked him how many nights he left their kids alone, or how many times he slammed a door so hard it rattled their bones. She cried because this fight, this endless, brutal, impossible fight, had left her empty. And in that moment, she thought, maybe they've won. Maybe they finally broke her. But just before her tears ran dry, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her swipe. "Ms. Wallace," said a calm, deep voice. She recognized it. Keller. "I can't discuss much over the phone," he said. "But I want you to know, what you did today mattered." "I didn't do anything," she whispered bitterly. "You stood up," he said, "and everyone who matters saw it." Tamika closed her eyes. He continued, "I'll be at the courthouse tomorrow. I suggest you be there too." Then the line went dead. Tamika stood in the darkness of her living room, tears drying on her face, the weight of exhaustion still pressing on her shoulders. But for the first time in days, there was a small flicker of something else. Not hope, not yet. But maybe. Possibility. And possibility is where everything begins. The next morning, the courthouse looked the same. Same cracked steps leading up to the front entrance. Same smudged glass doors. Same ancient vending machines humming in the hallway like they had been humming for decades. Magnolia Grove Courthouse hadn't changed in years, and likely wouldn't change for many more. But something in the air was different. Tamika could feel it as soon as she stepped inside, not in the words people spoke, but in the silence between them. A tension, a murmur, like a storm was building under the skin of this building and no one could name it. But everyone felt it coming. She moved quietly through security. No smiles, no greetings. The clerk who had sneered at her on day one now wouldn't meet her eyes. In the waiting area, her attorney, Jonathan Reed, was already pacing, tie loosened, hair slightly askew from what had clearly been a sleepless night. He looked up as she approached. "You came," he said. Tamika gave a tired nod. "Did you think I wouldn't?" He exhaled. "Honestly, I didn't know what to think. After yesterday, I wouldn't have blamed you if you disappeared." Tamika sat down on the bench beside him. She hadn't worn makeup. Her face was bare, honest, and tired in a way that felt permanent. "I don't run," she said quietly. "Not from my children. Not from anyone." He nodded, then hesitated. "There are rumors," he said, "about the man in the suit. Keller." Tamika looked at him sideways. "What kind of rumors?" Jonathan leaned closer, his voice lowering. "Some of the courthouse staff are saying he wasn't scheduled to be here, that his appearance wasn't logged in any state documents, that he bypassed state channels entirely and came straight from D.C. Word is, this courtroom has been on someone's radar for a while." Tamika's heart skipped. "Because of Mark?" she whispered. Jonathan nodded. "And others like him." She looked down at her hands. They were shaking again. She hated that. Hated the way her body still carried the trauma, even when her mind tried to stay steady. "Do you trust him?" she asked. Jonathan paused. "I trust that he scares the hell out of everyone in this building. That's something." Inside the courtroom, things moved slower than usual. People arrived in smaller groups, and conversation was hushed. Even the judge seemed subdued when she finally entered, her robe slightly wrinkled, her posture less rigid. But when Anthony Keller entered again, same presidential blue suit, same calm stride, the entire room shifted. It wasn't loud. He didn't say a word, but everyone felt it. Even the jury, seated once again at the side, watched him closely. The judge cleared her throat. "We are reconvening the matter of Wallace versus Halberd in the matter of custodial rights. Before we proceed, Mr. Keller, I understand you have requested time to address this court?" Keller stood slowly. "Briefly," he said, walking forward. He pulled from his folder a single sheet of paper and placed it before the judge. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low but sharp. "This document outlines a formal request for injunction on any custodial decision rendered yesterday or today, pending a federal investigation into this courtroom's record of procedural integrity, witness intimidation, and evidence suppression." Silence. Stone silence. The judge blinked. "You're issuing a stay?" "Yes," Keller said calmly. "And before the end of the day, your courtroom will receive a direct order from the Department of Justice confirming temporary federal jurisdiction over all open cases under your bench." Tamika gasped. She wasn't alone. The prosecutor tried to speak, but Keller cut her off with a glance. "I would strongly advise you not to contest this verbally until your office has reviewed the supporting evidence, which includes recordings, transcripts, and private communications related to the Halberd case." The air grew thick. Tamika's hands covered her mouth. Her vision blurred. Was this real? Keller turned to her. "Ms. Wallace, I've reviewed your file, not just the charges, but the character statements, the employment records, the incident reports that were excluded from the original hearing. and I want you to hear this clearly." He stepped forward until he was directly before her. "The system failed you." Tamika couldn't breathe. She wasn't crying, not yet, but the tears were right there, like a dam trembling at the edge. "You were never supposed to stand a chance in this courtroom," Keller continued. "They made sure of that. They dismissed your evidence, ignored your testimony. They allowed your ex-husband, a man with documented complaints of abuse, to dominate the process." He turned to face the judge, the jury, the gallery. "But that ends now." The courtroom exploded, not in volume, in energy. Whispers, shifting, the sound of a foundation cracking underneath decades of corruption. Tamika sat frozen. A whisper had begun to grow, not in words, but in possibility. For the first time in this entire nightmare, someone powerful had stood with her. Not out of pity, not because it made headlines, but because it was right. Later, in the empty hallway, Tamika stood alone. Keller walked up beside her, slow and thoughtful. "I'm not a miracle worker," he said quietly. "This isn't over yet. There are layers, politics, resistance. But I've seen cases like this before, and I can promise you, we're going to peel it back, one layer at a time." She nodded slowly. "Why now?" she asked. "Why me?" Keller tilted his head. "Because someone, a janitor, I believe, sent in a letter, no return address, just 4 sentences." He pulled a folded page from his inside pocket and read aloud. "There is a woman in Magnolia Grove. She's being destroyed by the people in power. She hasn't broken yet, but she will, unless someone does something." Tamika's lips parted, but no sound came out. Keller folded the paper again. "I think they were right," he said, "but not about the breaking part." He looked her in the eye. "About the part where someone does something." It was like watching a storm roll in from the horizon. Quiet at first, then heavier, then impossible to ignore. When Tamika stepped back into the courtroom the next day, something had changed. And this time, it wasn't just in her. It was in the way people looked at her. Not with pity, not with silent judgment, but with curiosity, even fear. A subtle current ran through the room. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone knew something was coming. And it had started yesterday, with a single word: accountability. That word had spread through the courthouse like a virus. By morning, even the janitor had heard it. So had the clerk. And the security officer who used to avoid eye contact with Tamika now opened the door for her and nodded. That hadn't happened before. Not once. Inside, the judge seemed stiff, restrained, like someone had tied her robe a little too tightly that morning. The prosecutor looked more nervous than usual, eyes scanning the crowd for someone or something she couldn't name. Halberd. Well, even he had changed. His body still sat with its usual arrogance, legs crossed, arms folded. But the edges had softened. His jaw was tenser, his stare less steady. He looked over his shoulder more than once. For the first time, Mark Halberd looked like a man uncertain of his power. Tamika didn't look at him. She didn't need to, because she wasn't here for him anymore. She was here for her children, and now, maybe for something bigger. Inspector Anthony Keller arrived 5 minutes after proceedings began. No badge this time, no announcement, just a quiet presence in the gallery, second row, leather folder in hand. But his silence said things. His silence was louder than the judge's gavel. The moment she noticed him, the judge cleared her throat. "We are reconvening today to allow for the review of newly submitted material from the Office of Civil Court Oversight," she said, her tone rigidly formal. This material includes alleged communications, audio evidence, and case discrepancies relevant to the Wallace custody matter. Mr. Keller has been granted federal authorization to present findings. She looked to Keller. He rose with the kind of calm only someone carrying the truth could afford. He walked forward, opened his folder, and began. His presentation wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but every word carried the weight of precision and purpose. First, he showed copies of internal emails between the prosecutor and Detective Halberd, exchanged during the weeks leading up to the hearing. Their tone was casual, overly familiar. In one message, the prosecutor wrote, "We'll bury her with paperwork. Make sure she's too exhausted to fight." Gasps echoed across the courtroom. Next, he played an audio file. Halberd's voice, laughing, saying, "She'll break before it even goes to appeal. That's what women like her do. Break when no one's watching." Tamika sat frozen, not in fear, in control. Then came the surveillance video, taken from a bar near the courthouse. The screen showed Halberd and the prosecutor sitting together, drinks in hand, mocking the judge, boasting about owning the court. It was ugly, brazen, raw. By the time it ended, the judge's face was pale. The prosecutor had sunk back into her chair, eyes on the floor. But Keller wasn't done. He placed one final document before the judge, a sealed statement from an anonymous whistleblower. "I won't read this aloud," he said, "but I will note that it confirms coercion of a state-employed social worker, pressured to write a false behavioral assessment against Ms. Wallace." The courtroom held its breath. Tamika's lawyer, Jonathan, looked stunned. So did the jurors. For the first time, the illusion had cracked. This wasn't just a messy custody case. This was systemic corruption, and it had just been dragged into the light. The judge sat still for a long moment. Then she adjusted her glasses and spoke, her voice tight and measured. "This court is placing a temporary hold on all custodial transfers. The children will remain in state care pending further review." Tamika flinched. Not what she hoped, but also not a defeat. Then the judge added, "And this court acknowledges the findings presented by Mr. Keller and will submit all related materials to federal review for internal investigation. Effective immediately, the prosecutor is suspended from this case. A new counsel will be assigned." Now that was a shift. The prosecutor's chair creaked as she stood and exited the courtroom without a word. Halberd stood too. For the first time, his steps were hesitant. He turned to leave, but Keller's voice stopped him cold. "One more thing," he said. Everyone looked up. Keller approached the bench again and placed a photograph in front of the judge. It was an image, blurry but clear enough to identify. Halberd, at the daycare, unscheduled, unauthorized, picking up Marcus without Tamika's permission. The judge inhaled sharply. "That's a direct violation of the standing custody agreement." Keller nodded. "That's not all. He was seen shoving the child into his patrol car when Marcus resisted." A murmur of horror spread through the room. The judge stared down at Halberd. Her voice trembled with something almost like rage. "Detective Halberd, you will remain in the courtroom for formal review of custodial misconduct. Do not leave this building." It wasn't an arrest, but it was a beginning. Tamika sat quietly as the courtroom emptied. Her hands were trembling again, but for a different reason this time. Shock, relief, still no tears, just silence. Keller walked over and knelt beside her. "They're going to ask you to speak soon," he said. "About what?" "About everything." She looked down. "I don't even know where to start." He smiled gently. "You just did." That evening, when she returned home, the first thing Tamika did was sit on the floor. Not the couch, not the bed, just the floor, where she could feel something solid beneath her for once. She picked up Marcus's drawing from the fridge again. "My hero is my mom." For the first time in what felt like years, she believed it. Not because she had fought perfectly, not because she had won yet, but because she never gave up. And now, the world had finally started listening. The courtroom was half lit the next day. The blinds not fully open, the lights dimmer than usual. A strange stillness hung in the air, like the moment just before thunder. People entered more quietly now. Whispers had turned to silence. Even the sound of heels against tile echoed too loudly. Tamika stood at the doors before entering, her fingers gripping the polished metal handle. She wasn't nervous. Not anymore. She was something else now. Steel wrapped in skin. Tired, yes, but sharper, focused. Hardened not by vengeance, but by clarity. She was ready. Inside, the room was already filling. The new prosecutor, a soft-spoken woman from Atlanta with sharp eyes, sat at the table reviewing files. The judge looked distant, scribbling notes but not making eye contact with anyone. And Mark? He sat stiffly, lips tight, jaw clenched. No more smirks. No glances toward Tamika. Just silence. A man watching the walls close in. Inspector Keller entered moments later and walked straight to the center of the courtroom with a stack of folders under his arm. The judge lifted her gaze. "Mr. Keller," she said carefully, "you may proceed with the presentation of final evidence." Keller placed the stack on the bench with quiet precision. "Your Honor," he began, "what I'm about to present are materials collected by federal oversight and verified through cross-referenced records. These documents include deleted communications, security footage previously excluded from court submission, and audio files provided by whistleblowers within this courthouse." Tamika's heart thudded once, a solid, grounded beat. It was time. The first piece of evidence was a transcript, an email exchange from 2 months prior between Halberd and the original prosecutor. "She's cracked. One more push and she'll either run or snap. I say we hit her with a surprise visit from CPS. Say an anonymous report came in." A cold hush filled the room. Next came a video. It played on a portable monitor facing the court. Surveillance footage from a gas station 2 towns over. The camera showed Halberd. He was speaking to a man in a plain shirt, handing over what looked like a sealed envelope. Keller pressed pause. "The man receiving this envelope is Fred Mackey. At the time, he was an off-the-books private investigator known to take unofficial assignments for officers in the area." He turned to the judge. "We have signed statements from Mr. Mackey confirming that he was paid by Detective Halberd to fabricate anonymous witness statements suggesting that Tamika Wallace was seen screaming violently at her children in public. These reports were used to support the neglect petition." Another breath left the room. Not just air. Faith. Keller continued. He played another recording, audio this time. Halberd's voice. "The kids are leverage. Once she sees I can take them, she'll stop pushing. I don't want full custody. I want her quiet." Tamika clenched her jaw. Her fingernails pressed into her palms. She wasn't surprised. But hearing it aloud, that was different. It made the poison real. The judge looked pale now. But Keller wasn't done. He placed a smaller folder on the desk. "In addition, we uncovered a series of internal complaints filed during Detective Halberd's previous assignments, including reports of excessive force, witness intimidation, and evidence tampering. These complaints were quietly dismissed or closed without proper investigation." He held up a final document. "This last item is a sworn statement from a former CPS employee who resigned in protest after being asked to falsify a safety assessment regarding the Wallace household." Keller's voice remained calm, but his words landed like punches. "She was told, verbatim, 'We need this woman to look bad on paper, no matter what.'" The courtroom was silent for several heartbeats. Then the judge spoke. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. This is catastrophic." Keller nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor. It is." Tamika didn't move. She didn't cry. She just watched. Because this moment, this unraveling, wasn't just for her. It was for every mother who had been silenced, every black woman who'd been told her anger was a threat, every victim who had been turned into a suspect. The judge cleared her throat, her hands visibly trembling now. I'm ordering an immediate review of the custody ruling. This court acknowledges that the original case against Ms. Wallace was tainted by fraudulent evidence and intentional misconduct." She paused. Her gavel hovered in midair. "I am suspending all rights of Detective Halberd effective immediately. Custody is to be returned to Ms. Wallace until such time as an independent review determines otherwise." The gavel struck wood, a sound like thunder. Tamika closed her eyes, not to block out the moment, but to feel it deeper. It was real. It had happened. She had her children back. Mark Halberd stood slowly, his mouth twitching. But he didn't speak, didn't protest, didn't even make eye contact. He just turned and walked toward the exit. And then, "Detective Halberd," Keller said sharply. Mark stopped. A federal officer stepped through the side door. "You are hereby placed under investigation for obstruction of justice, falsification of public documents, and witness coercion. Until further notice, you are relieved of all official duties and are not to leave the county without clearance." For the first time, Mark's face cracked. Real fear, real consequence. He was escorted out. No cuffs. Not yet. But it didn't matter. He was done. When the courtroom emptied, Keller approached Tamika once more. This time, he didn't speak. He simply handed her a sealed letter and walked away. She opened it slowly. Inside was a copy of her original character letter, the one that had been removed from her case file without explanation, the one from her hospital supervisor, the one that read, "Tamika Wallace is one of the most selfless, dedicated mothers and professionals I have ever met. I trust her with my patients' lives. I'd trust her with my own children without hesitation." Below it was scribbled one sentence in Keller's handwriting. "Sometimes they try to erase the truth, but it remembers where it belongs." Tamika stepped outside the courthouse into a sky that was finally blue, bright, open, free. She looked up, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel small. The hall outside the courtroom smelled faintly of old wood, paper, and dust, like history had lingered there too long, and no one dared sweep it away. But for once, it didn't feel oppressive. It felt quiet, still, open. Tamika stood in the corridor, her hands wrapped tightly around the sealed custody order. Her name, full, proud, untampered, was printed in bold letters at the top. Wallace Tamika, primary guardian, full physical and legal custody, reinstated. The hallway was empty now. Keller had already left without ceremony, like he always did. Her attorney, Jonathan, had given her a quiet fist bump before heading back to his office, visibly relieved to be part of a win for once. But Tamika stayed there alone for a while. She stared down at the paper like it was a birth certificate, like something had just been born again. Not her children, not her reputation, herself. Outside, the sun was waiting. When she stepped onto the courthouse steps, the brightness made her squint, not just from the light, but from the overwhelming clarity of the moment. Across the street, parked at the curb, sat a familiar car, and inside it, two small faces pressed against the glass. Marcus saw her first. He didn't wait for the door to open. He flung it open and bolted across the street like lightning. The social worker scrambled after him, but she was too slow. "Mama!" She caught him in midair, arms wrapping around him like a net spun from love and fire. He sobbed into her neck, trembling with every breath, and she held him like she could fuse him back into her body just to keep him safe forever. Jayla followed seconds later, slower, her eyes wide, cautious, unsure if this was real. Tamika opened one arm. Jayla stepped closer. Then she ran. The three of them collapsed to the sidewalk, tangled in tears, laughter, whispers of, "I missed you," and "I didn't forget," and "I'm so sorry." Pedestrians watched. Some turned away. Others smiled. But Tamika didn't see them. In that moment, there was no world but the one wrapped inside her arms. Her world. The drive home was silent at first. Tamika sat in the back seat between them. She wouldn't let them go. Not yet. Her arms around Marcus's shoulders, her fingers stroking Jayla's curls. Both kids clung to her as if they were afraid she might vanish if they blinked. She wouldn't. Not again. "You coming back?" Jayla asked suddenly, her voice so small it nearly vanished in the sound of the road. Tamika turned to her, tears welling up again. "I never left you, baby. They just tried to keep me away." Marcus looked up. "They said you were bad, that you hurt us." Tamika's chest tightened. She nodded slowly, choosing her words with care. "They lied, and I'm sorry you had to hear that. But you know what the truth is, don't you?" He nodded without hesitation. "You fight for us. Always." That was all she needed to hear. Back at the apartment, everything was just as she left it. And yet, nothing felt the same. The broken crayon was still on the floor. Marcus's school project still hung crooked on the fridge. But the silence. It had changed. Before, it was suffocating. Now, it was peace. The kids ran from room to room like they were rediscovering an entire world. Tamika stood by the doorway, one hand on her heart, one on the frame, watching them touch each item. Not for its value, but for the memory. "Can I sleep in my bed again?" Jayla called from the hallway. Tamika smiled. "You can sleep wherever you want tonight." Marcus reappeared from his room holding a book. "I want you to read this again. Like before." She took the book from him. "Tonight," she promised. "Every night, if you want." He nodded and leaned into her side. "You won," he whispered, and she realized she had. Later, as night fell, Tamika sat alone on the small balcony. The city hummed below. Wind brushed her skin. A single light flickered in the hallway behind her. She wasn't crying anymore. There were no more tears to cry. Only breath and stillness. And one thought repeating in her mind like a prayer. They didn't break me. The system tried. The lies almost won. But truth, slow, quiet, stubborn truth, had finally found its voice. And it had sounded like her. Across town, in a dim office, a fax machine printed out a formal notice from the Department of Justice. Subject: Internal Review of Magnolia Grove Judicial Operations. Below it, a red stamp. Under federal observation. Back in her living room, Tamika tucked her children into bed. Jayla was already asleep, one hand curled under her chin. Marcus fought it, eyes fluttering. "Tell me again," he said. "Tell you what?" "That story. About the lion." Tamika smiled and sat beside him, brushing his hair gently. "There was once a lion," she began, "who everyone thought had lost his roar. They poked at him, laughed at him, told everyone he was weak." Marcus yawned. "But one day the lion remembered who he was, and when he roared, they all listened." Marcus closed his eyes. Good. I like that one. Tamika kissed his forehead. I do too. In the quiet that followed, Tamika returned to her room. On the nightstand was a letter, the one Keller had given her. She reread it under the glow of the lamp. They'll try to bury you, but seeds grow when buried, and your roots run deep. She folded it carefully and placed it inside her Bible. Then, for the first time in weeks, she turned off the light and slept. News doesn't spread fast in Magnolia Grove. It spreads loud. By noon the next day, everyone in town had heard something. That the case had been overturned. That a federal agent had humiliated the local judge. That Tamika Wallace had beat the system. But they didn't know the story. They didn't know about the nights she'd cried alone in her kitchen, whispering her children's names into silence. They didn't know about the way she held on to a broken crayon because it still smelled like Jayla's hands. They didn't know what it felt like to walk into a courtroom where everyone had already decided she was guilty because of her skin, her status, her strength. They didn't know that she had almost given up, and that even then, she didn't. The local news station aired a short clip. No interviews, no spin, just raw footage of Keller placing evidence on the bench, of Halberd being escorted out of the courtroom, of Tamika embracing her children on the courthouse steps. The video spread. It reached Atlanta by nightfall, then Birmingham, then Chicago, and by morning. The internet did what it always does with truth and pain and power. It turned her moment into a movement. Her name is Tamika began trending, not because she was famous, but because she was familiar. A nurse, a mother, a woman who had done everything right, and still had to fight tooth and nail for her dignity. People shared their stories. Women posted about custody battles and judges who didn't listen. Black mothers wrote about being questioned at schools, in hospitals, on sidewalks, simply for parenting their own children. Lawyers reposted Keller's testimony. Activists demanded investigations into rural family courts across the South. One tweet read, Tamika Wallace didn't just win custody. She won a war the rest of us didn't know we were fighting. Tamika didn't check her phone for days. She didn't need praise. She had something better. Peace. At home, life began to rebuild itself. Not like it had never been broken, but like it remembered how to hold its shape again. Marcus returned to school. Jayla started sleeping through the night again. The fridge was full. The air didn't carry weight anymore. And Tamika, she was learning how to breathe. She went back to the hospital quietly. Her supervisor hugged her without a word and said her old schedule was waiting. Her coworkers didn't ask questions. They just smiled, left extra coffee at her station, and made space. People in town began to act differently. The barista at the cafe remembered her name now. The postman waved. Even the clerk at the grocery store, the one who never looked up, asked if she needed help to the car. Small things, but meaningful. The shift was subtle, but real. A week later, Keller called. His voice was calm as always. We've begun the wider inquiry, he said. Halberd's case opened the floodgates. 5 other custody rulings are under review. 2 other judges in neighboring counties are being investigated. Tamika didn't say anything at first. Then, "Did you know it would go this far?" "No," Keller admitted. "But I hoped it would." He paused. "And it wouldn't have happened without you." Tamika smiled, tired but steady. "I didn't do anything special." "You stood up," he replied. "That's always special." 2 days later, a letter arrived in her mailbox. It wasn't from the court, not the DOJ. It was handwritten, in careful cursive. Tamika opened it at the kitchen table. "Dear Ms. Wallace, my name is Rita Cole. I'm 72 years old. I've lived in Magnolia Grove my whole life. I watched your story from the gallery every single day. I never said a word. I didn't know how. But I want you to know. I believed you. I believed you the moment you walked in. I just didn't think anyone else would. You reminded me of my daughter, and of myself many years ago, when no one listened to women like us. I want you to know that I see you, and I thank you. Rita." Tamika read it twice, then she folded it slowly, and cried. Not the cry of someone broken, but the kind of tears that come when the world, after so long, finally says, "I see you." The next weekend, the local community center asked Tamika to speak. She declined at first. Public speaking wasn't her strength. She didn't think of herself as a leader. But Marcus asked her, "What if someone like you is sitting in the audience?" So she agreed. The room was small, 30 chairs, most filled. Grandmothers, teachers, single parents, one police officer in uniform who stood near the door with his cap in his hands. Tamika stood at the front. No microphone, no slideshow, just her. She told her story the way it had really happened, not like a victory lap, but like a lesson. She spoke of fear, of shame, of the moment when she thought it was over. And then she said this, "I didn't win because I was strong. I won because I didn't let them make me silent. And because one man in a blue suit said one word that reminded the world justice still matters." The room stood in applause, but Tamika didn't smile for the praise. She smiled because she finally believed it herself. Later that night, Marcus climbed into her lap, too old for it, but not caring. "Are you okay now, Mama?" he asked. Tamika nodded. "I'm okay." He leaned into her shoulder. "Are they okay now too?" he whispered. She looked out the window at the stars above Magnolia Grove. "Not yet," she said softly. "But they will be." The letter arrived 3 weeks later. Thick envelope, official seal, Washington, D.C. return address. Tamika stared at it on the kitchen counter, afraid to open it. Not because she feared bad news, but because, after everything, the idea of more felt heavy. She had spent weeks piecing herself back together, finding her rhythm, waking up to the sound of her children laughing in the morning, grocery shopping without side eyes, sleeping through the night without nightmares. This envelope could shake the stillness she'd worked so hard to build. But eventually, she broke the seal. Inside, a formal recognition from the Department of Justice. "Your testimony, your courage, and your endurance in the face of systemic failure have led to the opening of an official federal initiative, the Wallace Accountability Act." She read that line 3 times, then 4, and still couldn't believe it. The Wallace Accountability Act, a policy reform package aimed at addressing judicial misconduct, evidence tampering in family court, and abuse of power by law enforcement in custody-related proceedings. It was backed by a bipartisan group of senators, drafted in partnership with Keller's office, and named, at his insistence, after the woman who started it all by refusing to sit down when the world told her to disappear. Tamika's name, was on a federal bill. And not because she was a politician, not because she had power, but because she had told the truth. And the truth had been too loud to ignore. A week later, she was invited to Washington, not for show, not for photos, for purpose. The letter asked her to give a short address during the committee's opening session, just a few words, nothing formal. She said yes, not because she wanted to, because she needed to. The courtroom in D.C. wasn't like the one back home. It was bigger, colder, designed to intimidate. The ceilings were high, the walls paneled in dark oak. The people inside wore suits that cost more than her rent. But Tamika walked in like she belonged there. Because she did. Keller met her at the entrance. He wore the same presidential blue suit, same calm eyes. But this time, there was something else in them. Pride. "I told you," he said with a soft smile. "Sometimes one voice is enough." Tamika smiled back. "Only if someone listens." He nodded. "Today, they will." When she stepped up to the podium, she wasn't nervous. She was ready. There were no cameras, no dramatic lighting, just a microphone, a room full of lawmakers, and a silence that waited to be filled. Tamika cleared her throat and began. "My name is Tamika Wallace. I'm not a judge, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a politician, I'm a nurse, a mother, a black woman, and 3 months ago this country tried to take my children away, not because I did anything wrong, but because someone in a uniform wanted to punish me for being strong." She looked up. He lied. They believed him. I told the truth. They ignored me, but I kept showing up, because my kids needed me to. A pause. No one blinked. And eventually, someone did listen, and the truth came out. And when it did, it changed everything. Tamika leaned in. "This bill isn't about me. It's about every person who's ever been silenced. Every mother who's been treated like a suspect for raising her voice. Every father who's lost his children because he couldn't afford a better lawyer. Every kid who's been moved around like a file instead of a life." Another pause. The air was thick with attention. "I stood in front of a judge and was told I didn't matter. But I did. And so do they. And so do you." Her voice softened. "Justice isn't real until it reaches the last person in the smallest courtroom in the quietest town." She stepped back. Applause didn't follow right away. Only stillness. And then, one by one, people stood. They didn't cheer. They stood in respect. And Tamika, for the first time in her life, stood taller than them all. Later that night, back at her hotel, she sat on the balcony watching the city lights stretch across the skyline. The Capitol dome glowed in the distance. Cars passed below like silent rivers of light. She sipped tea, wrapped in a blanket, and peace. Marcus called. "Did they clap?" She laughed. "No, they stood." Jayla grabbed the phone. "Did you tell them about us?" "I told them everything." Jayla giggled. "I bet they cried." Tamika smiled. "Maybe." "They should. We did." After the call, she took out her journal, a gift from Keller. On the first page, he had written one sentence. "When they try to silence you, don't raise your voice. Raise the world." She flipped to a blank page and began to write. Not because she had to, but because the world needed more stories like hers. Stories that begin in silence, but end in revolution.